Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is McKaylee. I'm with Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. Especially after a year like 2020, we would not be here without you. We wouldn't be able to have amazing events like this one that we have here tonight. Tattered Cover turns 50 this year, 50, which is huge for a bookstore. And I really mean it when I say that we would not be here without our community support. Normally, we like to gather all in the same space and be a community space here in Denver, Colorado. But unfortunately, we can't do that right now still. Someday soon, really close to it. But thank you for being a part of our virtual community. I want to quickly let you know that closed captioning is enabled on this video. Down at the bottom, there's a black bar and a button labeled CC on it. Click that button and closed captioning is enabled for those who want it or need it. Also, for those of you who may be joining us outside of Denver, Colorado, Tattered Cover Bookstore is a local independent bookstore with 4 locations in the Denver metro area, soon to be 5, maybe more, we'll see. But I want to let you guys know that all of our stores are open right now, except for our Lodo store, which is currently in the middle of moving to McGregor Square. We're hoping that that new location opens up in May, but you can visit any of our other stores as long as you wear your mask over your mouth and your nose. You can come and visit us for about 90 minutes or so. Or if you're like me and you want to shop in your pajamas, I totally understand. Or if you're not in the Denver metro area, you can always shop online with us at tatteredcover.com. And now I want to get to our author of the hour here. I'm very excited for this one. It's going to be a wonderful event and a great conversation here. We have Mauro F. Guillen, and he was just named as the new director for the Judge School of Business at Cambridge University in the UK. Previously, he was the holder for the Zanman Dowd Professorship in the International Management at the Wharton School, where he also served as the director of the Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies between 2007 and 2019. His online classes in Coursera, have attracted over 100,000 participants from around the world. Professor Guillen received a PhD in sociology from Yale University, and a doctorate in political economy from the University of Oviedo in his native Spain. He is a trustee of the Royal Foundation of Spain and serves on advisory groups at the World Economic Forum. He has won the Aspen Institute's Faculty Pioneer Award. He's elected fellow of the Sociological Research Association and the Macro-Organizational Behavior Society, a former Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellow, and a member in the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Professor Guillen is an associate editor of the Administrative Science Quarterly and serves, or has served, on the editorial boards of the American Sociological Review, Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, and Journal of International Business Studies. Mauro Guillen was also a member of the University of Oviedo team that won the National Spain Basketball University Championship in 1987. And amidst all of those accolades, he has taken the time to come talk to us about his new book, 2030, which is what we'll be discussing today. And he'll be in conversation with David Back. And it is my honor to welcome both David and Professor Guillen. I'm going to have them turn on their microphones and their videos here. Perfect. Hello, Professor.
Hello, how are you? Thank you so much for your kind intro.
Oh, thank you. We're just waiting, David, to click
Here we go. I was having some technical difficulties. Excellent. McKaylee, thank you so much for arranging this and that intro. And Professor Guillen, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it so much. In preparation for this, I had prepared an intro in which I explained all the ways in which you changed my life. But then I looked up some videos, some talks you did on YouTube, and what I found is that again and again you are introduced by someone who says, I was a former student, I took this class, it totally opened my mind, then I worked for Professor Guillen, it was an amazing experience, it changed my life. And I kept hearing that again and again. I was like, well, that's even more significant than whatever happened to me. And it's sort of a testament who's in the audience tonight, some of your former students from Penn, some of my classmates from Cambridge Judge Business School have shown up to see their new director. And also my parents in Denver, Colorado are watching. They ordered the book, they're very, very excited. So I'll dive into your book 2030, which I found very fascinating. Strongly encourage people to get it. You can get it on tatteredcover.com, or wherever you get your books. And in it, you identify 8 major trends that are really going to transform the world by 2030. And I'm going to share my screen as I read them so people can see really how interconnected they are. And you'll see that that's exactly the word here. So, oh, all right, never mind. It'll require me to change my system preferences to do that. So unfortunately, we'll have to do it without the image, but it's okay. But the image is one of deep complexity and interconnectedness. And the message is that all 8 of these are not individual factors, but they're all happening and they're all interacting with each other. And the entire system of all 8 of them interacting with each other is far greater than the sum of its parts. And those trends are in the titles of your chapters: follow the babies, gray is the new black, keeping up with the Sings and Wongs, second sex no more, cities drown first, more cell phones than toilets, imagine no possessions, and more currencies than countries. And my first question is, how did you identify and select those 8 trends to research and write about? Oh, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are customers, patrons of independent bookstores. This is really wonderful. So look, I was focusing my mind on 3 categories of trends: population trends, economic trends, and technological trends. And then essentially I started doing research on this about 6 or 7 years ago. And I decided in the end to include a chapter, as you said, on each of these trends that you mentioned. But I wanted them to be interconnected, right? And so also I needed them to be somewhat in sequence so that it would be a series of chapters, although knowing that all of them were actually part of the same big, transformation that I think we're going through. But look, it's roughly speaking 3 population trends, 3 economic trends, and 3 technology trends. And believe me, they're going to change the world we're in. And by the year 2030, we're not going to be able to recognize where we are unless we start adjusting and we start thinking about what's going on now. But you put your finger on the more important thing, David, which is what's important here is to connect the dots, right? Is to think laterally, is to see how those trends come together to produce some really, really unanticipated outcomes.
So one of the big themes in your book is this concept of lateral thinking. I think you describe it as maybe the most important concept in the book. Could you explain a little bit about what lateral thinking means and what are some examples for individuals and companies?
So it means connecting the dots. And what it means then is looking for those unanticipated interactions across different kinds of trends. Let me give you an example. I think that's the best way of essentially conveying what lateral thinking is all about. So consider the following 3 things that are going on right now in the world, also here in the United States. So the first is that people are living longer, right? So life expectancy is on the rise. Here in the United States, for example, people now have about 30 years more of life expectancy on average than back in 1900. But even over the last 10 years or 20 has increased considerably. Second thing, people stay in much better mental and physical shape, especially in Colorado, I hear, by age 60 or 70 or 80 than people of the same age 2 or 3 generations ago. And that means that people then, when they reach those ages, they can continue having a very active lifestyle. I mean, this notion that we grow old and we become old people by some point, this is something that, is no longer as, important a notion any longer. And then the third thing, David, is that technological change is making knowledge obsolete much faster than in the past. So you put all of those things together. We're living longer, but we're staying in much better shape. And hey, whatever it is that we learn when we go to school, becomes antiquated much faster, then here's the implication. Here's the lateral thinking. In the future, I believe, we're not going to go to school only once when we are in our teens or in our 20s. Rather, every 20 years or so, we're going to have to go back to school, because whatever it is that we learn is going to be antiquated much faster. And of course, given that we live much longer, then we need to continue going back to school, continue learning, perhaps even a different profession or a different occupation. And perhaps we will pursue a different career. So that's the other big change. The average American, you may know, has or holds 12 different jobs over his or her lifetime, the average American. Well, now I think we're going to go into a world in which, instead of talking about jobs, we're going to talk about careers. And it could well be that the average American pursues maybe 3 different careers over his or her lifetime.
Yes, in your book, one theme is the stagnation of the middle class in the developed world. And you mentioned that across 30 years, Homer Simpson has had 200 different jobs, but no career progression. So hopefully with education, that can change. There's not enough time to discuss all 8 of these subjects that you bring up. And so I really do encourage people to get the book, either read it or listen to it. It really is interesting. I want to dive into just a few topics that you discuss, principally on the demographic side. So you discuss that the population center of the world, which right now is East Asia, is shifting southward to South Asia and Africa. And along with that, a lot of economic weight as well. And I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so what's going on is that in East Asia, that's also true of Europe, of course, there's fewer and fewer and fewer babies being born. That's in contrast with what's going on in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where still many more babies are being born, although the number is also dwindling over there, but more slowly than in East Asia or in Europe. But not only that, in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, life expectancy is actually growing faster. They're catching up with the rest of the world. So when you put those 2 things together, then essentially, by the year 2030, we're going to see that Africa becomes the 2nd biggest region in the world by population, becoming bigger than East Asia. And South Asia will continue to be the largest in the world by population. And Europe, by the way, David, Europe used to be the 2nd biggest region in the world in 1950. But by the year 2030, will be number 5 in terms of population.
Europe was 2nd by population in 1950?
In 1950, it was the 2nd region after East Asia. Wow. And over the last 70 years, again, because of their own demographic decline and the growth in other parts of the world, they're going to be falling by the year 2030 to position number 5 among regions in the world.
I was aware of
a dramatic change.
I was aware of the economic transformation since 1950, where economic power has really shifted far eastward. But that's fascinating that it really has been driven a lot by demographics.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And you refer to the chapter, about the Sings and the Wangs, keeping up with the Sings and the Wangs, which of course is a play of words on keeping up with the Joneses. So the middle class is stagnant, as you illustrated with the case of Homer Simpson in the United States. It's also stagnant in Europe, but it's growing by leaps and bounds in Asia, right? And also starting to grow in Sub-Saharan Africa from a very low level. So that transformation, that growth of the middle class in emerging markets is also going to change everything.
Mm-hmm. Then another big trend you talk about, both in the United States and globally, is the rise of women. From an educational perspective, from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, social perspective. And I'd love to talk to you about that as well now.
Yeah. So the title of that chapter is Second Sex No More ? Right? Look, many of the population changes that we've been talking about, especially the decline in the number of babies, has been driven by the fact that women in many parts of the world, though not all, now have access to better educational opportunities. And as a result of that, then, they have better opportunities in the labor market. Now, having said that, of course, we continue to see gender-based discrimination in the world. There's no question about it. And as you know, the pandemic has also hit women more strongly than men. For example, here in the United States, 2.5 million of them in America have withdrawn from the labor market because of the unequal distribution of tasks at home. They cannot have the children at home because the schools are closed and at the same time pursue their career. And that is extremely unfortunate. So it's the one trend that I think the pandemic has reversed, because the other trends that I described in the book have all been accelerated. But yeah, you mentioned that definitely women are becoming more important in all spheres of life. And let me just give you another piece of information there, which I think is very important. By the year 2030, more than half of the wealth in the world will be owned by women as a result of this change. So yes, philanthropy may change as a result of that. Politics, I think, will also change because, as you know, women are champions of different kinds of issues than when compared to men. And not only that, of course, hopefully there will also be some change in the corporate world, although, as you know, things are happening very slowly there.
You had speculated that if Lehman Brothers had instead been Lehman Sisters, the 2008 financial crisis might have gone very differently.
Well, I base that on the well-known fact that, for example, when you examine pension funds in this country and how men and women invest their pension funds, right, or make choices about which asset classes in which to invest them, the men systematically do two things. One is they take more risks than the women, and secondly, they trade more frequently. And as you know, both of those two things may be inimical to long-term performance. But yeah, it was a mild exaggeration on my part, but the argument goes, you know, if investment banks were run by women, maybe we wouldn't have so much instability in the financial system.
Right, right. And certainly, well, you speak about diversification with purpose from a financial perspective, but there again, it's diversification with purpose. The more voices you have, then I think the more resilient the system is. Another big topic that you discussed that I'd like to bring up is the effects of immigration and how that will continue to have a big influence going forward into 2030 and of course beyond. And you talk a lot about immigration and how it affects the job market. And you also talk about immigration and entrepreneurship. And so I'm going to share, well, so first of all, I have to say, I am so tremendously pleased that you cited this study because I was a research assistant at the Kauffman Foundation in 2011 for John Tyler and Bob Lighton writing the first draft of this paper. And so it's something I really believe in, and I'm so glad it's getting traction, which is that immigration really produces more jobs and it produces more job creators. And so you use the example, I'll quote from your book, Google, Intel, eBay, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Tesla have two things in common. They've transformed the American economy and they were founded or co-founded by immigrants. You say about 23% of all high-tech ventures in the United States are founded by immigrants or co-founded. And the proportion is as high as 40% in California, and 42% in Massachusetts, and 45% in New Jersey. So I'd love to hear your explanation of why is it that immigrants are not only creating companies at a higher rate, but creating the most successful companies at a higher rate.
Yeah, well, look, immigration is something that nobody looks forward to, right? Only people who feel that they're going to be better off if they move are likely to move. And only about 2 or 3% of the entire population of the world ever moves, becomes an immigrant. So immigration itself, David, think about it this way, is an act of entrepreneurship, right? You have to take the initiative. You have to be an entrepreneur in order to become an immigrant. And then, of course, immigrants, most of the time are not insiders to the game. So what they decide, either at the low end in terms of skills or at the high end when they get a PhD in some field of technology, what they decide is to launch their own business. And across all immigrant communities here in the United States, we see that there's more entrepreneurs than in the general population. But let me add another thing that I think is important in the middle of this pandemic. You see, between 25 and 35% of the highly skilled personnel that we have in our healthcare system in the United States, doctors, nurses, technicians, are foreign born, right? So for people who are against immigration, I think it would be really important to remind them that not only in the middle of a pandemic, but also with a rapidly aging population, we have no choice but to bring highly skilled medical personnel from abroad. We need immigration in this country. And of course, I'm biased because I am an immigrant myself, but immigration is one of the things that has made the United States such a great country.
Yes. You also talk about a phenomenon that you call brain circulation, in contrast to a well-documented phenomenon of brain drain. Can you explain what brain circulation is?
Yeah, so I borrowed the idea of brain circulation from a professor at Berkeley, Annalise Saxenian. What she observed is that many of these high-tech entrepreneurs who migrated from some other country, instead of staying here in the United States after they found the company, what they do is they start doing business also and starting companies in their country of origin. So this has been particularly common among Taiwanese, among Korean, Israeli, Irish, and now more recently also Indian and Chinese immigrants to the United States. So they come here, they attend school, they get an advanced degree, most likely in technology or maybe in business. They start a company, but then they don't stop there. They go back to their home country, they start another company, they come back here to the United States. So they are moving back and forth between the two. And that's what's called brain circulation, which is something that can be extremely beneficial to both the origin country and the destination country.
Mm-hmm. So the one thing I really appreciate about your book, and you mentioned that the title of the chapter is The Second Sex No More ? And one thing I really appreciate about this book is how many question marks it has. You are making some predictions about the future based on things like demographic trends, of which you feel fairly confident you can make predictions. But you're trying to avoid making predictions. You're trying to say, and here are some potential second order predictions. Here are some of the effects that might come from these trends that we know are going to happen. And you talk a lot about the good and the bad, which I really appreciate, because there's good and bad to every change. There's winners and losers. And I want to ask you a potentially sensitive question, which you don't have to answer, on the subject of brain circulation, which is that I know and I've witnessed that brain circulation is a major part of development for a lot of places. And I know the term in China was the returning sea turtles. The Chinese people who had gone abroad to the US and Europe or Canada for study, for work, and then came back and started many of these companies that changed China and changed the world, or did cutting edge research, or were quite transformative in other ways. And it happens in India and it happens in many other places. I wonder, as the world seems to be an increasingly unfriendly place, or that there's pockets of friendliness and unfriendliness, do you see a risk of brain circulation, especially around dual use technologies, when you have companies like Huawei, ZTE in China that are using US technology, or technology that may be originated in US labs that might present risks to the world?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer the question. I think the relationship between the US and China is extremely complex. Let's not forget that it's not just about they're making manufactured goods that then come over here. As you also know, David, they're exporting capital. And in fact, without Chinese capital, we wouldn't be able to fund the big deficits that we have over here, because China, along with Japan, is the largest holder of US Treasury bonds. But it goes well beyond that. I mean, there's cultural exchange between the two countries, students, moving back and forth. And as you're saying, it's also scientists and technologists. And I think it's fair to say that for the longest time, 20 years, 30 years, the Chinese economy has benefited from the arrival of foreign technology. But now China has developed its own capabilities in the area of R&D. And I think it's about time then that the relationship between the United States and China becomes a little bit more balanced, but more balanced not to the benefit of China, but rather balanced to the benefit of the United States in precisely that way. As you know, President Biden has actually said that he's going to continue showing a hard line, right, or adopting a hard line towards China in terms of intellectual property, in terms of technology, because it is a problem. It's an issue. So it's true that other developing countries, such as South Korea, Taiwan, and others, also were able to develop in the 60s, in the 70s, thanks to American technology. But most of the time, they paid for it, right? You pay royalties on technology. And I don't think that has been the case with China. So now that China is about to become a rich country, not yet, but almost. Now that China has its own R&D capabilities, I think the moment has come for the relationship between the US and China when it comes to science and technology to become a little bit more balanced. And by the way, this is one of the very few issues on which there is wide agreement in the United States across the aisle or across the political spectrum. I think right now, on both sides of our very polarized polity, I think there is an emerging consensus that the relationship between the two countries needs to be rebalanced.
Yes. So I'll ask one more question myself, and then I'll turn it over to audience Q&A. This book was released in August. And so, of course, you were researching and writing it pre-pandemic, but includes a very interesting afterword. I actually thought it was the most interesting part of the book, which is, well, how does this change in the context of this pandemic? What has to be updated? And I saw another interview you gave where you said, well, your biggest regret is you should have titled the book 2028 because everything's happening even faster. And as I said, I thought that was the most interesting part. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I did most of the research before the pandemic, but the book came out during the pandemic, and I was able to change quite a few things on the book itself. But you see, this pandemic, unlike other big pandemics in history, so you may remember the plague of Justinian 1400 years ago, or the Black Death.
I remember.
Yeah, well, I mean, you remember the history about it since you're a history major, or the Black Death in the 1400s, the 1300s. So look, those other pandemics changed the course of history, but not COVID-19. COVID-19 is accelerating most trends. I think the biggest exception is the one that I mentioned about women. But consider, for example, the adoption of technology, right? This pandemic is accelerating that trend that was already going on before the pandemic. The rise of East Asian emerging markets. The pandemic is also accelerating that because they have managed, unlike us, to minimize the number of cases, hospitalizations, and fatalities. And consider also population aging. Well, there's 10% fewer babies being born in the United States these days because of the pandemic, because young couples postpone having a baby when they see that there's so much uncertainty. And perhaps, one of them or both have lost their jobs. So this pandemic is a great accelerator with only a couple of exceptions. One, I think, is women and their progress. It has been at least delayed for a while. And then second is cities. As you know, a lot of people are now reconsidering where they live in the age of remote work.
Yeah, I would think another thing that's not stopped but delayed slightly is the growth of economic power in South Asia and Africa, which unfortunately have not had the resources to respond to COVID-19 in the same way as North America or East Asia.
Could you repeat the question? That was a comment rather than a question.
I think another one of these trends that you've identified that will be slowed a little bit is the shift of economic power to South Asia and Africa.
Well, yes, to the extent that, as you know, they're having more trouble over there with the pandemic, right? But not in Sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly not in East Asia. As you know, in most East Asian countries, Vietnam, Taiwan, China, South Korea, you can count with your fingers how many fatalities they've had over the last 3 months. It's really stunning.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating. I have to be honest, I'm sitting here I never took an economy class. I never took business. I was theater and English my whole life. And it was, this is fascinating. Did we lose Mauro? Is he still there? Yes, he is.
No, he's here. He's here.
So I want to turn it over to audience questions, which some of you have already been active in the chat, but the chat next to the screen that you're watching us on right now is where you can ask questions. And we have one already of, how will MBAs change in terms of value, curriculum, or otherwise in 2030? And how will you be addressing these new changes as the director of CBS?
So there was a moment in which go ahead.
No, that's okay. I'm happy to repeat the question. Not a
Yes,
problem.
please.
Yeah. How will MBAs change in terms of value, curriculum, or otherwise in 2030? And how will you be addressing these changes as the director of CBS?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think the future of business education has never been brighter. Because we're going through all of these transformations, right? Demographic transformations, economic transformations, technological transformations. And this is affecting not just business, of course, it's also affecting nonprofit organizations, it's affecting governments and so on and so forth. But all of these changes, these big transformations, they need to be managed. So I think that's how I think MBA programs, business education is going to change. We're going to have to educate people who can help society and the economy handle all of these changes, right? And then I think there's another revolution coming, of course, which is the incorporation of technology, not as a substitute for classroom instruction, but rather as something that may help create a better learning environment. So, for example, I'm teaching a class now at Wharton, in which it's completely virtual. It's about digital platforms, and I have no fewer than 25 guest speakers from all over the world. Right? Without this type of technology, we wouldn't be able to do that. So I think technological change is essentially creating huge opportunities for innovation in terms of the pedagogy, in terms of the kind of learning environment that we're creating. And so when I start in September at Cambridge, what I'm going to do is see how we can take advantage of this wave of transformations that we're seeing in the world. Because once again, I think that the world is in great need of people with the necessary skills to help us get through these transformations in all different kinds of organizations. So by the same token, we also need to change, you see, because the only possible response to change is change itself. So educational institutions, and as you know, they are very medieval, especially Cambridge, they need to change, right? Because otherwise it's going to be really hard to keep up with what's going on.
Absolutely. I want to ask a little bit about the book itself, and why did you feel the need to write this book now?
Well, I started doing the research for the book about 7 years ago because I was making presentations outside of campus. I do a lot of speaking events, and I was detecting that people back in 2005 or so, 2015, they were very, very apprehensive about what was going on in the world. And I felt I needed to do something about that. So I wrote the book as a roadmap. I wrote the book as a guide, helping people understand that all of these trends that we've been talking about, they come together to produce very, very big results, very big outcomes, huge transformations. So I wanted to help people get prepared for that. That was my motivation.
Wonderful. That's awesome. And that's great to know. Thank you for taking the time for this book. I want to ask too okay, this is a really interesting one. Is there anything that you didn't get to put in the book that you want a chance to say either now or in the future?
Oh, absolutely. And perhaps this will become the core of my next book, because I'm already working on my next book, of course.
Tell us.
Look, I have a working title, 2040.
Yeah. No, it's going to have a different kind of title, but it's also going to be about all of these transformations. But look, there was one thing that I underestimated, which is remote work. And look, we're going to go back to the office. We're going to go back to our workplace, but we're going to continue to use these digital platforms to work. And hopefully they will make us more creative and more productive at work. But what I completely misunderstood until very recently, maybe the last couple of months, is that because now we have the ability of actually working together, but on a remote basis, because we have gone through this big experiment and both companies or organizations and workers have learned how to use these technologies, now I think something really peculiar is about to happen. I think we're going to witness in the next few years the emergence for the first time of a truly global market for talent. So in other words, companies halfway around the world would say, okay, I need another marketing expert. I need another, creative director. Let me look for that person throughout the world. And if they find the best candidate in a completely different country, they can tell that person, you don't have to move. You can work on a remote basis. And look, this is going to benefit companies, especially smaller ones that before this, they couldn't tap into those pools of talent on a global basis. I think it's going to benefit workers with differentiated, with unique skills. But unfortunately, as always happens with technology, there's also going to be quite a few workers who are going to suffer if they don't have differentiated skills.
No, absolutely. I've got two more questions here before we end our talk this evening. One of which is, when speaking about remote work, what do you think that's going to do to real estate markets and office leasings? Because there are definitely some companies who are not going to go back into the office. What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in surveys, the chief financial officers of American companies, 30% of them say that they're going to reduce their real estate footprint. Okay, square meters of footage of real estate, office space, and so on and so forth. I think it's going to be, in the end, way more than that. So my colleagues at Wharton who study the real estate market, they're telling me that commercial real estate is going to have a little bit of a downturn because of remote work practices. However, shared office space, after we put the pandemic behind us, such as, for example, what WeWork does as a company, there may be a boom in that. In other words, that there's going to be more demand for shared working space. And then when it comes to residential, I don't think prices in big cities like New York or San Francisco are going to go south that quickly. But certainly, what we're going to see is that locations that are maybe 20, 25 miles, 30 miles away from downtown are going to become more attractive. And so prices there, I think, may actually go up.
Makes a ton of sense, honestly. So in these last couple of minutes that we have together, this question is for both of you. And it's something that we love to ask here at the end of Tattered Cover, which I don't know if David actually knows that we asked this question at our end here. But it is for both of you. And David, I'd love your answer first, and then we can end with our author of the hour here. But what did this book teach you? You can interpret that in whatever way you want. But David, if you could start with us, with your answer, and then we'll go tomorrow. And what did this book
I've learned so much from Professor Guillen, and this book distills a lot of it, but I really thought it was very interesting to think about how the pandemic is accelerating trends that have already been in place, and how that is different than often has been in the past. That was really I thought the most interesting part of this book, and I learned a lot.
Well, my response to that question as a writer is that, you see, some people believe that when you start writing a book, you already know what you're going to be writing about. And that's never true, because you bump into so many unexpected twists and turns. You discover new things along the way. And quite frankly, for me, the biggest thing that I think I've learned from this 7-year-long process of writing this book was that, I never realized how quickly the world is changing. And in a way, how privileged we are to be able to be witnesses to these huge transformations. Because I don't think we've gone through transformations on this scale for a very long time, possibly since World War II. So it's been 70, 80 years since we've gone through such large-scale transformations. And of course, I fully realize some people will suffer as a result of them. But I think from an intellectual point of view, as a writer, as a reader, I think it is certainly our privilege to see so many things unfolding before our eyes. And I never realized how quickly the world was changing. My instinct was that big things were happening, but not to the extent that I report and I document in the book.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the 7 years of time and the countless research and study that it took up until this point to be able to make these kind of predictions. Thank you for this gift of the book. I want to just remind everybody that they can get copies of 2030 at tatteredcover.com. We really encourage you to do it, as endorsed by one of our co-owners and his parents and everybody else that has read this book so far. We definitely think that just because a book comes out in 2020, it should still have a fair chance. And we really think that this is one that is worthwhile. So we encourage everybody to get their copy. Mauro, thank you for your time this evening. I do want to give you a chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else you want to say before we close out tonight.
So, well, as you introduced me at the beginning, I'm Mauro Guillen. I have an accent. I'm from Spain. I'm a professor of Wharton. And soon I'll be moving to the University of Cambridge in the UK. People can find me on LinkedIn. And I would be very happy to continue the conversation that way. The book can be found everywhere, but especially at your nearest independent bookstore.
And I just want to say, I'm very confident under your leadership, Oxford is going to be left completely in the dust.
I'm already working on it.
Perfect.
Rivalry still runs strong here. Well, thank you everybody once again for joining us. You can find new events that we have coming up, including another one with David, with Alex Lazaro on Friday, April 2nd at 6:30. So we welcome you all to register for that and other events at tatteredcover.com/event. Thank you again for supporting local independent bookstores with us here tonight. If you two gentlemen will stay on while I finish closing us out here, I want to thank you all again, and stay safe, everybody. Happy reading. Thanks. Bye-bye. And we're out.